People ask me all the time, they're like, Mauricio, can I 1031 into a syndication if they're an LP or if they're a sponsor? They're asking, hey, can I accept 1031 monies into my syndication? And the answer is yes, but meaning yes, you can do it, but there are certain caveats or certain considerations that you've got to look at. And after looking at those considerations, you may or may not want to do one. But can it be done? 100%. And so I wanted to talk about that today. There's really three caveats. Number one is sort of the legal piece, like what are the legal limitations that come into play, whether it's securities law or otherwise. Number two is the IRS limitations, and that's actually the big one. You'll learn that there isn't that big of a deal with the legal part, but it's really an IRS problem or a tax limitation. And then the third one is the lender, right? You always want to have the lender involved. So let's talk about the legal piece. From a legal or structural standpoint, let me just start by saying that from a syndication standpoint, from a security standpoint, zero issues. There's nothing in here when you take a 1031 investor who's relinquishing a property and wants to go into your syndication. There's nothing different from a syndication standpoint. You still have to comply with securities laws. You still have to register, find an exemption. It's illegal. Most of you will use 506B or 506C. That part is almost irrelevant. The only structural thing we have to be concerned about is, as you guys should know, when the 1031 sells the property that they're in, they cannot go into the syndication this way, meaning they can't go in as LP in your syndication, because in order to do a 1031 exchange, you have to do what's called a like-kind exchange, which means you have to go from one property into another property. And so when you go from a property into a syndication, or as a members of an LLC or a limited partners into a limited partnership, that's not a like-kind exchange. So you're not eligible to do that. So what you have to do is the 1031 exchange person or investor has to come into the deal as a direct owner of the property. So they have to have title to the underlying property. So in this example that I'm showing you, if you're buying a property at 123 Main Street, and let's just say it's $1 million property, and let's just for now not incorporate debt into it, just to make the numbers easy. But let's say that the relinquishing property, they're going to end up at, let's say, $200,000, and they want to bring in that $200,000 into the syndication. They have to have direct title into the property. And so in this scenario, the 1031 exchange, let's say they have $200,000 to bring in. You would then create your syndication and raise the $800,000 into your syndication from the LP money, right? And then the syndication LLC would own, in this example, 80% of the property, and the 1031 exchange person would own 20% of the property as tenants in common. So that's the key here. Instead of the 1031 investor going into as an LP into the syndication, they're going to go in as tenants in common. And they're both going to be tied together by what we call a tenants in common agreement. That's the structure you have to follow if you're trying to get somebody into the syndication. As I mentioned earlier, there's nothing different from a syndication standpoint, from a security standpoint. This 1031 investor is still an investor. You still have to follow the securities laws, bringing that investor's money in. But instead of being a 10% owner or whatever of the syndication LLC, they're going to be direct title to 123 Main Street and own a percentage of the property. So like I mentioned before, from a legal standpoint, no problem. Syndication standpoint, no problem. But the main limitation is that it does have IRS issues. Now, remember, I am not a CPA. I am not a tax attorney. So you want to make sure it's doubly critical. I don't know if that's a word or not, but you want to make sure that you have a really good CPA on your team. And I also like to bring in sort of the qualified intermediary that's involved in the 1031 exchange, get them on board, and just make sure that whatever structure you're putting together is blessed by the CPA, because this really is a tax issue. And the main tax thing that pops up, or the main limitation, is because it has to be a tenants in common, it cannot be a partnership. You have to fall into what's called the IRS Revenue Procedure Code 2002-22. What the hell is IRS Revenue Procedure Code 2002-22? I've got it right here in front of me. But there's essentially 15 limitations that you are subject to when you're doing a structure like this. Now, Only a few of them apply really to syndicators, and those are the ones I want to talk about right now. But there are 15 limitations, and those are the ones that you really need to think through and determine whether you want to do it. So let's go through them. The first one is you're limited to 35 TIC members. Now, I don't think that's a big deal because you're usually going to have one, maybe two, at least two 1031 exchange people. So in total, you'll have 3 TIC members, since one of them will be the syndication LLC. But I can't imagine a world, I've never seen a client bring in 34 TIC members into their syndication, but there is that limitation that technically would apply to you. The main limitation that probably dissuades most syndicators from doing this is that you have to distribute profit and loss according to their percentage interest. So in the example I gave you, if there's $100 in profit, I have to give $80 to the syndication LLC, and I have to give $20, that proportionate profit, to the 1031 investor. I can't do anything fancy. I can't do a preferred return. I can't do an 70-30 split, 50-50 split. You can't do any carried interest on that portion of the investment. So the 1031 investor money, you cannot profit essentially in the form of a carried interest anyway, your sweat equity from that money, because you have to distribute everything according to ownership percentage. So let's give a more realistic example. You bring in an investor and they actually only own 5% of the property, right? So it's like 95% to the syndication LLC and 5% to the 1031 investor. You can't say, hey, I'm going to take 20%. I mean, it's an 80-20 split. So I'm going to give 80% of the money to the investors and 20% to me. I have to give that 1031 investor 20% of the profits. So the only way I can profit from that, and this is kind of the third element that allows you to do that, is you can take a reasonable acquisition fee and you can take a reasonable asset management fee, so long as those are charged, again, proportionally, right? So if I want to charge, make some easy numbers, I'm going to charge a $10,000 acquisition fee, you would have to charge $8,000 to the syndication LLC and $2,000 to the 1031 investor. It has to be proportionate. Now, once the money goes to your syndication LLC, so let's say I distribute the 80-20 split that this example gave, then once the money's in the syndication LLC bank account or whatever, from then on, you can split that however you want. At that point, you can have a 7% pref, 8% pref, 50-50, like your usual waterfalls that you would do in a syndication. But that's only once that proportionate share has gone to the syndication LLC. Remember, the syndication LLC is one of the TIC members, and then the other TIC members is the 1031. But you can charge a reasonable asset management fee and a reasonable acquisition fee. Now, the one thing you've got to be a little bit careful about, or maybe a lot careful about, is that on the acquisition fee side, you can charge the 1031 investor their proportionate share of that, but you don't want to take that from their acquisition funds. Like, so in my example, you don't want to take their fee out of the $200,000, because that'll create a tax issue for them, because then they're only really contributing $195,000 or $190,000 and giving you an acquisition fee. So only that $195,000 is eligible for the 1031. So you generally want to factor in that and pay that a cash flow. So you say, hey, I've got an acquisition fee. I'm charging again, $10,000 acquisition fee, no problem. $8,000 of that is going to be paid by the syndication LLC. That one actually can be paid cash right away. But the 20% that you're charging, or the $2,000 you're charging to the 1031 investor, should be coming out of cash flow. Otherwise, the investors, from a tax perspective, is putting in less money and therefore has what we call a boot problem. This is not meant to be a 1031 seminar. The first one is no more than 35 ticks. Second is you have to distribute profit and loss proportionately. Number 3 is you can take reasonable acquisition fees and asset management fees. The fourth one is voting. You have to give that person voting rights. And in fact, in order to sell the property, they have to give you the okay, right? And so in my mind, it creates a little bit of a veto power on behalf of the 1031. Like, if you decide at the end of the 3 to 5 year plan that you want to sell the property, and for whatever reason, the 1031 investor doesn't want to, they want to continue holding on, they're going to have a lot of leverage on you, because you're not going to be able to just sell the entire property. You're going to have to get their sign off from that sale. And so they have to be sort of a little bit more involved, not on the day-to-day, because you definitely don't, they're a passive investor, right? They're part of the syndication as a passive investor, but not the day-to-day, but certainly the major decisions, sell, refinance, and all that stuff. You do have to have their their blessing, so to speak. So in my mind, the way I see that is they have a veto power. The other thing I would mention too, it's not really one of the 15, but there are certainly some risk disclosures that we're going to be providing all the other LP investors. There's some risk disclosures because you're not a CPA. I'm not a CPA. We're relying on your CPA to make sure this is all kosher. But in the event that for whatever reason doesn't work and it blows up the 1031 for whatever reason, then it can come back to bite the entire syndication, right? So that's a disclosure that we want to make. Is that, hey, we're not tax professionals. We're not giving tax advice. We've spoken with a tax professional. They've advised us of XYZ, but there's always a risk that the IRS agrees with the tax professional was wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's so important to work with a really good tax professional. And then there's also the sort of the proportionate share of the debt, which is the other piece that sometimes is uncomfortable. So in the example I gave you, if there is a loan on the property, so if there's $1 million property and you're getting a $800,000 loan, then the lender is first of all, from a 1031 exchange standpoint, you want to have that 1031 investor be on the hook for the loan, but the lender is going to most likely require them to get underwritten because they are direct title. So that's the issue with the IRS. That's really the main limitation that we have. Again, from a structural standpoint, we can structure it however you want. From a security standpoint, as long as we're following the securities laws like we've talked about here, no problem. But it's really the IRS piece that really throws a little bit of a wrench into the problem. And the main one, I think, is when people realize that I can't take a carried interest on, and when I say carried interest, I mean the sweat equity. I can't take that compensation from the piece of the 1031. I can take it on the rest of it, but not on the 1031. Depending on the size of the investment, that may not be something the sponsor wants. And it turns into a situation where they're bringing in the 1031 money in order to be able to close the transaction, not necessarily because they want to sort of, again, make money from that money. So I'm not going to say you're working for free, but you just can't get compensated from that 20%. And then from a lender perspective, again, you just want to let the lender know what you're doing. The lenders will want to know what's going on. They often, we have usually our tenants in common agreements that we draft up a lot of times, or not a lot of times, all the time. The lenders want some specific provisions in the TIC agreement. So you want to let your lender know that this is what you're doing. They may also require, I think most of the time, again, every lender is going to be different, but most of the time I've seen lenders want to only have one point of contact. So even though the TIC agreement may have a little bit more involvement with the sort of the 1031 person, the bank doesn't want to deal with all the people. They just want to deal with one person. And again, it's the same thing with everything else with the lender. When the lender says jump, you say how high. Otherwise, you've got to go get yourself another lender. So those are kind of the three pieces that we look at. Legal, syndication, not a big deal. Tax, big deal. That's where the limitations are. And then always wanting to have the thing. David, cash flow from the syndication LLC. Yeah. So typically I think of these things as two separate layers, right? So there's the TIC layer, the tenants in common layer, which, by the way, I would recommend you have a separate bank account for the tenants in common. It's a little bit weird because it's not really a separate entity, but you can, first of all, you can get an EIN for the TIC, even though it's not a separate entity. You can get a TIC for that sort of not partnership, but that arrangement. I would open up a bank account for the TIC where there's just two members in that bank account, right? So that all of the profits, not all the losses, all of the profits go into that bank account first. You pay your debt, you pay all your expenses, you pay whatever you're going to pay. And then when you're ready to distribute, you would distribute the proportionate share to the syndication LLC, which goes to the syndication LLC bank account, right? It has their own bank account. And then the other piece will go to the 1031 investor directly. But once the money is in the syndication LLC bank account and it's at the syndication level, then you can treat it like any other syndication, preferred returns, splits, you name it. Your whatever waterfall you want to do at that point, sky's the limit. It's just at the TIC level that you can't do a waterfall. You have to distribute all profits and allocate all losses according to percentages. So even depreciation, I can't mess around with depreciation. I've got to give. If it's an 80-20, if 80% is owned by the syndication LLC, 80% of the depreciation is going to go over there, 20% of the depreciation is going to go over here. Best practices to add to 1031 language to your PPM prior to the capital raise. Talk to a securities attorney. I mean, that's what they're there for, right? That's their job. You don't need to get concerned about the weeds. You just let your attorney know, hey, I want to bring in a 1031 investor, and they should be able to, describe it, articulate structurally what you're doing. And then for me, it's twofold. It's the structure. Right? This is how it's going to work. Syndication LLC is going to own 93% of the property. Or sometimes it's crazy. Sometimes I did one where it was like multiple decimal points. A syndication LLC is going to own 93.647% because it's so exact. So that's the structural part. And then just the risks. Again, there are some additional risks that they're not likely, but again, PPM is all risks, right? Or all material risks. So you have to disclose the risk of what if the 1031 blows up? What if the 1031 person gets upset because they thought they were getting a tax thing. It turns out they didn't, and they end up suing the syndication for it or everybody. So it's just disclosure language. If you'd like to join us live on these episodes and have a chance to get your specific question answered, you can simply go to realestatesyndicatorlive.com and register to be live on the show. Hope to see you then.